For 8 months, an old widow and her blind son had been sleeping 60 feet beneath the streets of Everett, Washington, inside the boiler room of a theater the whole city believed was empty. No windows, no heat beyond what the old iron pipes still held. A single mattress on a concrete floor, 2 thin blankets, a camp stove, and a tin cup of water that grew a skin of cold by morning. And across town, in a tower of green glass, the man who owned that theater signed the order to tear it down over a breakfast that cost more than they spent on food in a month. His name was Hollis Renning, and the whole city loved him. He paid for the children's hospital wing. He put his name on the new art scholarship. He smiled in the newspaper with a gold shovel in his hands. What nobody knew, what Renning himself did not know, was that the building he was about to flatten still had 2 people living underneath it. And what he could never have guessed was that one of them, a blind young man of 20 named Eben Brisco, had spent those 8 months listening to him through the pipes. Then, one cold Tuesday in November, Renning came to walk the theater one last time before the wrecking crew arrived. He pushed open a steel door he assumed led to nothing but an empty mechanical room. And down in the dark, a young man who could not see his face turned toward the sound of his footsteps, tilted his head, and repeated, word for word, in Renning's exact rhythm, a sentence Renning had spoken 3 weeks earlier alone, in a room upstairs he had been certain was empty. It was a sentence that could put him in prison, because the boy in the basement had heard all of it. And buried inside all of it was the one truth Hollis Renning had spent 12 years and an enormous amount of money making sure no living person could ever approve. That the fire that killed Eben's father, that burned the sight out of an 8-year-old boy's eyes, that branded a good man a criminal in his own grave, had not been an accident. Renning had guarded against every camera, every witness, every page of paper. He had been careful as only frightened, powerful men are careful. He had simply never, in 12 years, thought about who might be listening in the dark. That door did not open onto an empty basement. It opened onto a lie Hollis Renning had buried 12 years before. And to understand how a blind boy came to hold it, you have to go back to the fire everyone blamed on his father. Marlys Brisco was 59, and the basement was not where her story began. Once she had a small blue house, a husband who could fix anything, and a boy who fell asleep to the hum of his father's voice. Wendell Brisco was the Carillon's engineer, and he had kept that theater alive with his hands for 20 years, hands the man who owned it would never have shaken unless a camera was nearby. He brought Eben to work and taught the boy to find things by sound. Tap a pipe. Is it full or empty? Tap the wall. Where's the hollow? Wendell wore a steel tuning fork on a cord at his neck, and Eben learned the whole building through that one ringing note. A man who can really listen, his father told him, is never lost in the dark. Eben was 8. He did not yet know how soon he would need that to be true. The fire came that spring, with Eben in the building waiting for his father to finish a repair. For 6 months, Wendell had warned Renning that the wiring behind the east wall was a death trap, and Renning had refused to pay. It started exactly where Wendell said it would. He carried 11 people out through the smoke, then went back a last time, for the stagehand who had dropped and for his own son. He got the man out, then shoved Eben ahead of him toward the loading dock. Run, Eben. Run. Just as the ceiling came down behind them, Eben felt his father's hand leave his back in the dark. He never felt it again. The boy lived, but the smoke and heat had scarred both his eyes, and over the following weeks the world dimmed, and then closed, until there was nothing left but sound. A surgery could fix it one day, the doctors said. Then they named the price. $41,000, 12 years ago. She might as well have been handed the moon. And the man Wendell had warned made sure not $1 of help ever arrived. No settlement. No apology. A fire inspector named Orlo Hatch signed a report that laid the whole disaster on a dead man. The insurance paid, the lawsuits vanished, and Wendell Brisco's name went into the paper a final time. Not as the man who carried 11 people out of a fire, but as the careless engineer who said it. Marlys buried her husband under that lie. The man who built the lie was Hollis Renning, then a developer with one building and a mountain of debt. The money from the Carillon fire was the seed of everything he became. 12 years took the rest. The blue house, then an apartment, then a rented room. then a back that gave out, a job that ended, bills that never stopped. The last eviction notice came on a Tuesday, and by Friday there was no address left to write on a form. Only a church pantry bag in one hand and her blind son's cane in the other. So Marlys went back to the one building on Earth that still felt like her husband. And all of it would matter 12 years after the fire, when the man who had buried Wendell's name came to walk that building one last time and opened a door on the sun he thought the fire had silenced. The Carillon was chained and condemned by then, runnings to flatten whenever the city stopped delaying it. But the watchman who still checked the padlocks was Lemuel Pike, Lem, who had known Wendell for 30 years and helped carry his casket. When Marlys came to him with nowhere to go and a blind son at her side, he neither lectured her nor turned her in. He pressed a key into her hand, showed her the alley door where the camera had died years before, and told her which nights he made his rounds so she would know when to keep still. Wendell kept this place breathing for 20 years, he said. It can keep the two of you breathing a while. Then the old man looked off down the alley, so she would not have to thank him. So a widow and her blind son came to live in the boiler room of a dead theater. Marlys built a life the size of a closet, swept the concrete, rationed the stove fuel, walked 2 miles each way to a church pantry with the food hidden in a canvas bag. And every night she lay beside her son in the deepest dark she had ever known, listened to him breathe, and told herself the same 3 things. We are still here, we are together, and tomorrow I will figure out tomorrow. Eben did something else in that dark. He listened to the building. The Carillon was one great hollow instrument, its iron pipes carrying sound from the basement to the roof as a shell carries the sea. He could hear the traffic on Hewitt Avenue, rain on the roof far above, the building groaning as it cooled at night. He kept his father's tuning fork on the cord at his own neck now, and when the dark grew too heavy, he tapped it once against the pipe and let that one pure note travel up through the sleeping building and come back to him. And for a moment his father was not gone. Then, about 3 months before that November, the building began speaking to him in a voice he did not know. Footsteps on the stage floor near midnight. 2 men, inside a building that was chained and condemned, with no lights Lem ever logged. They came back the next week, and the week after. Always late, always in the same room off the mezzanine, where the heating pipe ran straight down into the boiler room and emptied its sound into Eben's ear as clean as a telephone. At first he caught only fragments. One voice, low and certain. As long as it comes down before anyone goes looking, the Brisco end of it stays buried. He did not know yet whose voice it was. He only knew it was a voice used to being obeyed, and that it had said his own name in a room it believed was empty. Marlys begged him to stop listening. Whatever they are doing up there is not ours, she whispered. If they find us, we are finished. But you cannot tell a blind man to stop hearing. The voices came down the pipe, whether he wanted them or not, and he held every word, because holding things in his memory was the only way he had ever held anything. Then came the night, 3 weeks before the door opened, when the owner's voice said all of it. Renning, and the shaking older voice he called Hatch, arguing about money and silence, and a demolition that kept slipping. And then, flat and tired, dropping down the pipe like a stone into a well. The Brisco file dies when this building dies. That's the whole point, Orlo. We bury the proof in the rubble. We pour the foundation on top of it, and the engineer stays the man who burned his own theater down. He's been dead 12 years. Let him keep the blame. Once these walls come down, nobody can ever take it off him. Eben lay in the dark 60 feet down and stopped breathing. He was 8 years old again, smelling smoke, hearing his father shout at him to run for the loading dock. The man who owned these walls had just said, in plain words, that Wendell Brisco was innocent, that the proof existed, that in a matter of weeks it would be dust under a foundation, and his father would be a criminal forever. He did not sleep that night or the next. He said nothing to his mother because he knew she would tell him to let it go, and he knew she would be right. But something in him had changed. For 12 years the world had walked past him. Now, he held the one thing that could pull a king to the ground. He did not yet know that in 3 weeks, the king himself would open the boiler room door. Hollis Renning came to the Carillon on the morning of November 14th to walk it one last time. He told the truth to no one, least of all himself. He wanted to stand by the east wall one last time and be sure the wiring he had been warned about, the wiring that had killed Wendell Brisco and blinded his son, was still sealed inside it, 3 days from being rubble forever. For years this dead, chain building had been the one place he could speak with no staff, no cameras, no record. It had kept his secrets perfectly. It never once crossed his mind that it had been keeping anyone else's. His assistant, Sigrid Alto, came with him, carrying the folder and the silence of a woman who had long since learned which questions kept a job. And so did Lem with the keys, and Lem's whole body was a held scream. Every instinct in him wanted to bolt for the alley and warn the two below, but he could only follow him from lobby to basement stairs. When Renning asked for the mechanical room, Lem heard his own voice say the boiler was dead and the air down there was bad, and Renning was already going down. There was nothing left to do but hand over the key. There was no other choice in the world. The lock turned. The steel door swung in. And Hollis Renning, who owned half the city's new skyline and the better part of its council, reached for a light switch out of habit, found it dead, lifted the small flashlight from his coat, and shone it into a room he expected to hold nothing at all. The beam found a swept floor, a camp stove, folded blankets, a tin cup, a mattress, and sitting upright on that mattress, calm as still water, a young man with clouded eyes that gave no flicker toward the light, a blind young man who turned his face toward the sound of Renning's breathing with the precision of a needle finding north. For a long moment, nobody in that doorway made a sound. Then the young man spoke, low and clear, and his voice filled the concrete room. "The Brisco file dies when this building dies," Eben said. "That's the whole point, Orlo. We bury the proof in the rubble, we pour the foundation on top of it, and the engineer stays the man who burned his own theater down." He tilted his head a fraction, listening to the silence he had just made. "You said that 3 weeks ago, upstairs. I have every word of it, and every word of everything else you have said in this building for 3 months." Renning's flashlight did not move, but the hand holding it had begun to shake. "Who are you?" he said, and the young man almost smiled. "My name is Eben Brisco. My father is the man you let them call a murderer. And you just told me there is proof he wasn't, hidden in this building you're about to bury." He rose to his feet and found the iron pipe beside him out of habit. "I can't see your face, Mr. Renning, but I've heard your voice in my sleep for 3 months. I know it anywhere now, and I am not going to forget a single thing you said." Renning recovered fast. Men like him always do. By the time Marlys came running down the corridor, the church pantry bag still in her arms, drawn by the voices, he had already rearranged his face into something warm and reasonable, and he began, in his calm and practiced voice, to offer them the world. He was so sorry, he said, that they had been living like this. He was a man of considerable means, as they surely knew, and he could end all of it today. A house, a real one, warm, theirs by the end of the week. An account that never ran dry. And the surgery. He knew the surgeon, he knew the cost. He could sign the check by lunch, and Eben would see again. See his mother's face. See the sky. He asked only one small thing in return. That they let the dead stay buried. That the name Brisco and the word fire never again be spoken in the same breath. Then he said the thing that split that basement in two. "Mrs. Brisco," he said, gently, almost kindly, "a name cannot keep your son warm. A grave cannot give him back the sky. Wendell is gone. Eben is still here. Choose the living one." He crouched then to bring his voice down close to the blind young man's face, and his tone went soft as a friend's. "Son, you have not seen your mother's face in years. I can give you that by spring. All you have to do is let a dead man rest." And no one spoke. Not Lem, not Sigrid, not even Renning. The whole basement waited to see what a mother would sell to let her child see. Because Renning was not threatening her. He was tempting her with the one impossible miracle she had wept over 1,000 nights. All she had to do was let her husband stay guilty. All she had to do was sell Wendell's name for Eben's eyes. And what mother, standing on cold concrete with a blind child and an empty bag, would not have been tempted by that? Marlys's fingers moved toward the check before she knew they had moved. Her whole body leaned toward the word, yes. and Eben, who could not see the check, but who had learned every sound his mother made in the dark, heard the catch in her breath, the small broken sound of a woman about to say it. So he said it first. No, the word landed harder than a shout. He said it to Renning, but he said it for her. You don't get to give me my eyes as the price of taking my father's name. I would rather stay blind the rest of my life and know he was a good man than see your face tomorrow and let the world keep spitting on his grave. He turned toward his mother, his clouded eyes finding her by the sound of her breath. Mama, 12 years. He carried 11 people out of that fire, and they called him a coward in the paper, and we let it stand because we had no proof. Now this man has told me the proof exists. It is in this building. We are not selling that. Not for a house. Not for money. Not even for my eyes. Tell me you know that. For 12 years she had prayed for Eben's eyes. Now she was praying for the strength to refuse them. I know that, she said. God help me, I know that. She turned to Hollis Renning, and her voice did not shake. You can keep your house. You can keep your money. And you can keep your check. My husband is going to be an honest man again before they pour 1 ounce of concrete on this building. Now get out of his theater. That night, after Renning's car was gone, Marla sat in the dark beside her son and hated herself a little for being strong. She had just refused the thing she had begged God for since he was 8. And Eben, who was not as asleep as he pretended, lay still and hated that being right had cost her so much. Then she wiped her face. They had 3 days. 3 days to find a thing hidden 12 years ago, somewhere inside a building the size of a cathedral. Renning did not waste them. He had Lem fired by phone that same afternoon, and private guards posted at the brass doors by dark, with orders that the site was sealed and no one was to enter. He told himself the file was safe behind its wall, 3 days from gone. But the file was not where Renning believed it was safe. It was where only Eben could ever find it, because Eben remembered. But Wendell had not trusted paper to the living. He had trusted the building. 12 years gone, his small hand in his father's, Eben had heard him tap a panel behind the boiler and say it low and serious. If anyone ever tells a lie about this place, the truth is right here. Behind its heart. That night, while the guards drank coffee in the lobby 6 floors up, Eben led his mother through the dark of the mechanical room with the tuning fork in his hand, striking it against iron and brick, listening for the one spot where the note went thin and hollow instead of solid and dead. And then, boots on the stairs above. A flashlight beam slid under the boiler room door and crawled across the floor toward them. Marlys's hand clamped over Eben's mouth. His own closed around the fork to smother its ring. They pressed back into the dark, not breathing, as the light swung across the very wall they were opening, and stopped. It held on the half-pried panel for a breath that lasted a year. A boot scuffed the concrete above. Then a radio crackled somewhere up in the lobby, and the light snapped away, and the boots climbed back toward it. Only then did Eben let the fork ring again. Strike. Listen. Step. The note came back full, came back full, came back full, and then, beside a painted-over panel, it came back hollow. Here, he breathed. Mama. Here. It took them an hour with a pry bar. Behind the panel, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, was a flat metal box, and inside it everything Wendell had hidden in the last month of his life, when he understood that the man he worked for would let the building kill someone before he would spend the money to fix it. His dated maintenance logs. 6 months of signed warnings to Hollis Renning about the east wall wiring, each one stamped received by Renning's own office, and a copy of the safety report that officially never existed because Renning had ordered it destroyed. At the bottom, in the corner, 2 initials. S.A. A dead man had reached 12 years through the dark and put the truth in his blind son's hands. The box was not enough. Paper does not destroy powerful men until frightened people decide to speak. Renning still had the lawyers, the money, and a city that loved him. A box of old papers from a condemned building could vanish as easily as the first report had. It would take more than proof. It would take people willing to say his name out loud. Marlys carried it out before dawn, not to Renning, but to a reporter at the Everett Herald, a gray man who had covered the fire as a young one. He went still when he reached the signature at the bottom of the logs. Wendell Brisco. 12 years ago he had written the story that buried that name. Careless engineer. burned his own theater down, and a small private doubt had walked behind him every year since. He looked at the dead man sign warnings shaking in his hands, then at the widow his front page had helped ruin. I wrote that he did it, he said. God forgive me. I am going to write the truth louder than I ever wrote the lie. When the reporter laid that report in front of Sigrid Alto and asked if it was real, she did not look at him. She looked at the corner of the page, at 2 letters in her own hand. S.A. on a safety report she had filed in the months before the fire and been ordered to bury. For 12 years she had feared renting more than she had pitied anyone his money buried, and told herself she was only an assistant. The 2 letters said otherwise. She laid her hand flat over them, then took it away. It's real, she said. I filed it. He told me to lose it. I will say so under oath. Orlo Hatch lasted less than 10 minutes. When investigators showed him Wendell's sign warnings, the old inspector folded onto his own step. He told them about the money, the pressure, and the report Renning had dictated to him word for word. Then he wept like a man finally too tired to carry the lie. Renning's empire did not fall in a basement. It fell in daylight in front of cameras on the morning the wrecking was set to begin. The morning Hollis Renning posed before the chained Caroline with a gold shovel and that famous warm smile. The mayor at his shoulder, reporters and donors in folding chairs. At the very back, in a coat too thin for the weather, stood an old woman nobody thought to recognize. He was mid-sentence about progress when a reporter near the front stopped asking about the towers and asked, instead, about a fire. About Wendell Brisco. About a safety report that was never supposed to exist. Renning kept the smile up and reached for the next question. But the next question was the same, and so was the one after that, because the Herald had run the story at dawn and every person in those chairs had read it before they sat down. The smile came apart on camera, one muscle at a time, in front of the whole city that had loved him. The gold shovel hung in his hand, with nowhere left to dig. The wrecking crew never lifted a finger. By noon a judge had ordered the Caroline left standing. At the back, the old woman pulled her thin coat tight, turned, and walked out into the cold before he ever found her face in the crowd. She had not come to watch him fall. She had come to make sure Wendell rose. By the end of the month the charges came, the plaques came down, and the city learned what his money had been hiding. The empire he had built on the seed money of one covered-up fire came apart. Not all at once, but completely. He had guarded against every eye. In the end he was undone by a pair of ears in a basement, and a dead man who would not stay silent. The Caroline stayed standing, and a trust took it on. The settlement the Brisco family was finally owed was not a fortune, but it was enough, a roof, warmth, an end to counting, and a weight set down after 12 years. When the brass doors opened again and the great organ sounded for the first time in over a decade, there was a new brass plate in the lobby where everyone who entered would pass it. This theater stands because of Wendell Brisco, engineer who gave his life carrying 11 people out of the fire, and whose name the city was wrong to forget. Marla stood in front of it on opening night and laid her fingers against her husband's name, as she used to lay them on his chest while he slept, and only then did she let herself weep where people could see. And Lem was given the keys openly this time, and an office with his name on the door. Eben took the job his father had held. He knew the building better blind than any sighted man alive. His blindness was not a thing to be worked around. It was the very reason he was the best person on earth to do it. But when the money for the surgery finally came, Eben did something no one expected. He waited a full year, learning the rebuilt Caroline by ear first, as his father had taught him, before he let any doctor change how he met the world. Then, on his own terms, his father's name already clean in brass, he had it done. The bandages came off on a Thursday. He asked for his mother before they let him open his eyes. And when the light came in, blurred, then sharp, then unbearably clear, the first face Eben Brisco chose to see in all the world was hers. She was older than the voice he had carried. There was gray he had never pictured, lines the dark had kept from him for 12 years. He had never seen anything more beautiful. "You look tired, Mama," he whispered. Marlys laughed through her tears. "I was waiting," she said, "for you to see me." And in the sound booth of the Caroline, on a nail beside the board, hangs a steel tuning fork on a worn cord. Every night, before the house lights drop and the organ takes its first breath, the theater's engineer, a young man who can see now, but who will never stop listening, lifts it down and strikes it once, and lets that single pure note travel up through the whole living building and come back to him. The way his father taught him. The way the dark remembered when no one else would. So tell me honestly, if you were Marlys, your blind child beside you, the cure within reach, would you take the money and let the lie stand? Or would you do what she did and choose a dead man's name over your son's eyes? Comment one word, money or name.